Port of Seattle has a mission to be the greenest and most energy-efficient port in North America. We are leading the charge to sustainable aviation fuels, installing green technology, envisioning a green corridor to Alaska, and restoring critical habitat.
Thank you so much for joining us for an evening with Mossback's Northwest. I am Sara Bernard. I'm Crosscut's podcast producer, and I have had the pleasure of working with Knute Berger on a number of projects, including Mossback, the official podcast of the Mossback's Northwest video series, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a bit. But before we get started, we'd like to thank our title sponsor, Port of Seattle, our supporting sponsor, Bedrooms and More, and our in-kind sponsor, True Cup Roasting Company. Also, we would really like to thank all of you for coming and for your support for KCTS9 and Crosscut. We really, really, really couldn't do it without you. So thank you. There will be an audience Q&A at the end of the discussion. So for those of you who are in person, please visit slido.com, SLIDO.com, and enter the code Mossback. For those of you watching online, just type your questions into the chat. Also, everyone in attendance, both in person and virtually, has been entered into a raffle for a Mossback bobblehead. So yeah, we'll pull the in-person winner at the end of the show. So stick around. And if you are... That's going to be the best part. But yeah, if you're a virtual guest, you will be notified via email if you've won. All right. And so now for the man who needs no introduction, but I'll introduce him anyways. No. Mossback himself, Knute Berger.
Thank you for the non-introduction. And thank you all for coming, for turning out. It's really great to get to see the viewers and the readers and the podcast listeners in person. TV feels sometimes like kind of a one-way communication. And so it's great to see you here. And I look forward to answering your questions and having a great conversation with Sara. Let's go. And I just wanted to say about the bobblehead. So I have a grandson who just entered first grade, and he was asked to, they're all doing show and tell about their families. And he was asked to bring something about his parents and his grandparents. And I'm represented by a bobblehead. So I'm kind of worried what the kids will think if I ever meet them.
Yeah, I love that. All right, well, let's take a look at why we love Mossback so much.
Every time I come here, something has changed. Sometimes the changes are subtle. Sometimes it's more dramatic, like a big mammoth tree falling in the woods. History's that way. History doesn't stand still. To me, a Mossback is not someone who was born in the Northwest, but it's somebody who comes here and knows their home.
This is really a rock and roller ride, isn't it?
Together, let's keep history from standing still.
I don't know if you all know that there's a podcast, but because we just launched it this year. It's in its second season, and the video series is in its sixth season. So it's been around for a little while. We have a lot of episodes from the past, but the podcast is essentially, in some ways, it's an extension of the video series. We kind of, Knute and I get on mic and talk a little bit more about what each video episode is about, and he brings in his personal experiences, or maybe there's some other character from history that relates to the topic, and we kind of just go deeper. So Knute calls it Deep Moss.
Deep and deeper moss, yeah.
Right. It's a lot of fun. You should check it out. But so I just wanted to quickly introduce that. In some ways, it is kind of an extension of the video series in the sense also that Knute was telling me I guess the first couple of seasons, maybe in the early Mossback video series, it was like 2 minutes long. Each video were only about 2 or 3 minutes long, and then you got some audience feedback.
Yeah, yeah. So when I came to work here, they asked me if they told me something I'd never been told before, which they said, "We think you'd be good on TV," and they said if we had you do some shorts, and they call them interstitials because they kind of fit between everything else. What would you like to do? And I said, well, I want to do local history, and I'd like to build the episode around perhaps an artifact, an object, something we could talk about and tell the story of. And so we began filming the episodes in a place we call the Mossback Den. It's actually a conference room upstairs. And I brought in tons of books and stuff like the Space Needle lamp, and we decorate it, and we began filming them. And one of the feedback that we got, they proved to be very popular. People really liked them. We got a lot of nice feedback about them, and people said, well, they're too short. We want you to do longer things. So as we've gone on, we do more things on location. We've up the production values, and now the episodes are about 6 minutes. So we've doubled at least what we were doing before, and it's really fun because we can tell a pretty good story in that amount of time.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I guess the podcast becomes the sort of like, the doubling again and again of the deeper and deeper moss. And so, yeah, it's sort of, there's always more to the story is the long story short. But
Very true.
Always. But yeah, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what does go into the production process for those 6 minute videos. Because even though they are short, they're longer than they used to be, but a lot goes in. I mean, a lot of people involved. And
yeah, there's, in fact, I think some of the folks are here tonight, but it's a team game. TV is a team game. And as a writer, I'm sort of used to sitting down, writing a story. It's between me and the laptop or the computer. And I write the Mossback episodes, and I also present them. But, I have a wonderful producer, brand new producer for season 6, Michael McClinton. You're here somewhere. Raise your hand. He's there, back there. And he's the one that, orchestrates all the music and the visuals. And, we research together, but he's the one that has to find all those sort of visual and audio resources. And then I think also here is David Quantic, who's the editor of the series. There he is back there. David is just a brilliant editor who, paces the story. He figures out animations, illustrations, maps, all kinds of stuff that he puts together. And last year we got nominated for 2 Emmys. Mm-hmm. So I've yet to bring the statue home, but hopefully season 6 will do the trick. But their work is really fantastic. I'm sort of the face of it all, but there's a whole team. Rusty Bacall, are you here? He's way in back. He's our cameraman, brilliant cameraman with lighting and everything. So it's really fun to see these things kind of come to life in a way that they don't necessarily live on the page.
Exactly. There are all these visual elements, and sometimes shooting in interesting locations with various challenges that you encounter. If you've told me some of those stories, there are probably so many, but I don't know. For example, you were in Seward Park,
right?
Recently.
So we actually just were filming last week. We were doing some last-minute filming of an episode that will be in the upcoming season, and it needed to be in a place that had old-growth forest. And Seward Park is, one of those few parks in Seattle that has old growth. And so we filmed there, and it was so interesting being in an urban park. People kept coming down the path, and there was enough gravel on the path that you could kind of, before they got there, it was crunch, 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 and the mic would pick that up. So I'd start to, give my spiel and have to stop and start over and stop. And then Seward Park manages to get air traffic from SeaTac, Renton Airport, plus float planes. And so if people weren't crunching up and down the path, it was like a plane would take off, and the minute it would go silent, you'd have what felt like maybe 10 or 15 seconds, and then something else would happen. And then we were close enough to a playground, and it was in the middle of a weekday, but some daycare or kindergarten or something came down, and a load of kids started playing and laughing and screaming in the park. So it took us a while to get everything recorded. That's just the kind of thing that, is pretty typical. It's just sometimes making a 6-minute video can take weeks. And it can take a long time to shoot it, what with all the kinds of things that you have to deal with on site.
Exactly, yeah. And you have a teleprompter usually, right? So you don't have to memorize your lines, but That's
right. I don't know if I'm revealing a big secret here, but I can't memorize very well. And so they figured that out. And so I use a teleprompter. And it turns out one TV skill I have is I can read a teleprompter pretty well. And we were filming, this was 2 years ago, we were filming in Eastern Washington, and we were doing an episode about the outlaw Harry Tracy, who was this very bad guy who escaped from a prison in Portland and went on a rampage. He killed like 14 guys while they were trying to capture him. And he had been in Butch Cassidy, the Hole in the Wall gang, Butch Cassidy. Anyway, he was in a gunfight. He finally got caught by a posse at a ranch in Eastern Washington, just outside of Creston, if you know where that is. Channel Scablands, it's wheat country. And there's actually a rock where he was killed in this shootout, and they call it Tracy Rock, and it's a big hunk of granite. And so I wanted to shoot this episode at Tracy Rock, and which we did. But there had been a brush fire that had burned all the grass around it, and it was still smoldering when we were there filming, still smoking, and there were a bunch of charred cow bones over there. And we were doing the last scene, and we had this teleprompter which fits on the front of the camera, and it's a mirror thing where you put a piece of paper down and it reflects it so you can read it, but the camera doesn't see what you're doing. And we were doing the last scene, and Rusty was setting up the camera, and suddenly this mirror mechanism just fell off and landed on a piece of granite and shattered into a million pieces. So, it was a very expensive piece of equipment. But so I had to memorize my lines. And I was finally able to deliver them. But and I'm actually very proud of that last shot in that episode where I'm delivering my lines. But so we confront all kinds of oddball challenges in the course of shooting an episode, and it's super fun. We get out and see lots of great parts of the state. We learn a lot about history while we're there, other stories that maybe we should be doing.
Yeah, I haven't been on these shoots myself. We just talk about them, but I don't know. It sounds like you get to see a lot of interesting places and sort of tour interesting things. For example, you're talking about the D.B. Cooper episode from last season. You guys had to go kind of hunting, or wanted to go hunting for a period plane. Right.
Can I ask how many people here in the studio audience saw the D.B. Cooper episode? Yeah, a lot of folks. That's great. And it was a very popular episode, but it was really complicated because we wanted to show 727 from the 70s, and we wanted to show the interior and the cockpit. We also wanted to be able to lower that rear stairway that D.B. Cooper lowered when he parachuted out of the back of the plane in mid-flight. And just part of the complexity was we found a wonderful 1970s vintage. The interior, it was perfect. The cockpit was intact. It's at the Museum of Flight in Tukwila. And so we went there and we filmed that. But the stairway there didn't work. And so the producer had to call all over trying to find a 727 with a working stairway. And we actually found one in Everett that's used, I think, by the community college, has an aviation mechanics program. And the whole thing is gutted, but the stairway worked. So we had to go all the way up to Everett, and the stairway, I didn't know this, but nowadays the stairway has to be hand pumped down. And so one of the crew had to, pump the stairway down, and then we had to pump it up, and then pump it down and pump it up. But anyway, that episode, that was just kind of a fun aspect.
Yeah, and you were telling me, I don't remember if this made this into the podcast, but you were telling me at some point during the shoot, you guys were trying to get a shot of you jumping off the stairway, but you decided against that one. You didn't use that cut or something.
Yeah, they didn't. I thought I did a pretty good job of jumping off, but I probably would have killed myself on the concrete. But that's a story. Just add one thing. I love doing stories that I'm sure no one's heard, or stories that we have a novel angle to. People also, there are a lot of people who are new to the region and want to know. We did an episode on the Kingdome, and that stemmed from the fact that I was wearing a Kingdome T-shirt, and people would come up to me and say, "What is that?" And that's not even history to me, but it is to other people. So we did a whole thing on the Kingdome, like, what is the Kingdome? Well, with D.B. Cooper, that's a story we all think we know, right? And the element that surprised me when I was doing research, I was like, well, what can I find out about D.B. Cooper that is new? And what really surprised me when I did a lot of reading and everything wasn't his identity. I don't care who he was. There are like 7 people have confessed on the deathbed to being D.B. Cooper, right? Well, only one of them is right, maybe, And there are hundreds of suspects, and I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. But what was interesting to me was how many people wanted to be D.B. Cooper. Not only claiming on their deathbed, but even at the time when they did man-on-the-street interviews, people were like, I think he should get away. Anybody who can get money like that, deserves to get away. I just thought that was really, really interesting and said something about the American psyche at that time.
Exactly, right, exactly. I mean, and I did, myself didn't know a lot about D.B. Cooper when I was doing the research for the podcast episode. I also was kind of struck by not only how many people wanted to be him, but how many forms of media were sort of created around him, including a new HBO special and all this. And we got, I don't get a ton of feedback, I guess, directly, but you field a lot of feedback from Mossback episodes of various kinds, and from the video, somebody wrote a poem. I don't know when they wrote it. Maybe they wrote it in response to the video.
No, it wasn't in response to the video. There was a guy on Mercer Island who had written and self-published poetry, and he had this kind of epic poem about D.B. Cooper that he sent me. And I printed it I put out a weekly newsletter called the Mossback Den, and I printed the poem in there, and then I recited parts of it on the D.B. Cooper podcast.
Yeah.
But I just love the way people were inspired in different ways. And the poem, it's kind of corny, but it's also insightful. It's actually a pretty interesting poem.
Yeah, it was beautiful. So if you want to listen to the podcast episode, there'll be a recitation of part of that poem. But yeah, I love that there's such a degree of feedback that you get for some of these episodes, including a poem. Briefly, before we get to discussion of the second season, one thing I think is also interesting and important is that there is such an active audience for Mossbacks Northwest that you'll get feedback that actually sends you down new paths of inquiry and sort of alerts you to things that you didn't think of or didn't see. So, for example, when you were making the episode about the Seattle freeze, I understand there was like accidentally footage from downtown Seattle in the 1940s that showed a Confederate flag, and it was like in archival footage, and you didn't realize that it was there almost. It was so fast, but then there were like multiple people who saw it. Fascinating.
Yeah, no, it was a color film that was shot in 1940 of downtown Seattle, and across Fifth Avenue, what it turned out to be Fifth Avenue, was a bunch of what looked like bunting. But people viewing it at home saw that there was a Confederate flag in the middle. And then when we blew it up and looked at it, we realized that the bunting, the red, white, and blue bunting, was the Confederate national flag. And then the battle flag was there. And, people wrote in saying, what is the Confederate flag doing flying over downtown Seattle? And why didn't you say anything about it? Well, I didn't say anything about it because I didn't even notice it. And so I decided to try and answer that question. And I told the viewers, I'll find the answer to this. Well, it turned out the footage was home movie footage of the opening of Gone with the Wind, which opened in January of 1940 here in Seattle at the Fifth Avenue Theater. And, when I read descriptions and I checked it against the footage, and I could see a line around the block from the theater, but I couldn't find any reference to the Confederate flag until finally, after hours and hours and hours of going through the newspaper databases, calling up old newspapers, I finally found a reference. I think it was in the PI that said, Confederate flags are festooning Fifth Avenue for this magnificent film, that kind of thing. So that told me like why it was there and why, and so I had that why, but then that led me down this sort of rabbit hole of, well, why did people think that was okay then? And that led me to, looking at Birth of a Nation and the play The Klansman, which played at the Moore Theater, and there were protests. And this is back, before World War I. And this sort of sequence of Seattle's racial attitudes hardening and changing over time. So I actually wrote that as an article for Crosscut that just went into that detail. And that was very unexpected, but some sharp-eyed viewers were the ones that cued me that there was something weird in that video.
Exactly. So we really appreciate y'all. I mean, it's an amazing thing that kind of what you learned was really illuminating, and it was sort of only because of viewers like you. So speaking of which, as you may know, a new season is premiering tomorrow at 8:50 on KCTS 9. But so before we're gonna talk about the new season and everything, but before that, we'd like to show you an episode from the new season. It's called Amundsen Snowshoes, and outside of our staff, you guys are the first to have seen it. So enjoy.
The early 20th century has been called the heroic age of polar exploration. By ship, dog team, aircraft, and on foot, explorers sought the ends of the earth. And what's little remembered now is the role Seattle and the Pacific Northwest played in the polar probing that dramatically changed our understanding of the planet. One man in particular sought aid, rest and repair, money, and moral support here, and he left clues about that legacy in artifacts that remain, like the snowshoes of the greatest polar explorer of all time. Who was he, and why was he here? Today, climate change is opening Arctic waters as ice melts. But it wasn't always so. Finding a water route through the far north was long a goal for explorers and colonizers. Explorers like Captain James Cook of Britain came to the Northwest seeking the legendary Northwest Passage, a northern sea route rumored to link the Atlantic and Pacific. Empires hungered for the trade such a passage would bring. They sailed until they were stymied and sometimes crushed by the ice. The loss of an expedition led by the British Navy's Sir John Franklin, who was seeking the Northwest Passage, spurred more exploration. Franklin and his crew entered and then vanished into a forbidding icy realm in 1845. Search parties for his ships and crew were unsuccessful, but they extended geographic knowledge. Franklin's quest and fate inspired a 15-year-old Norwegian boy to find answers. His name, Roald Amundsen. In the early 1900s, Amundsen was part of a new generation of explorers that was determined to conquer the ice. He dreamed of traversing the Northwest Passage by ship, and eventually he found a way. Norway wanted to assert its rights to northern lands and shape a new national identity, and these ambitions fueled Amundsen's drive. From 1903 to 1906, Amundsen led an expedition going by boat, a converted herring boat called the Goya, from Greenland through northern Canada to Alaska. It took patience, requiring this small craft to be locked in ice as it inched its way across. When the Goya emerged after 2 winters in ice, Amundsen became the first to have navigated the passage by boat. Amundsen returned triumphant in Seattle, where he was feted by the large Scandinavian community. The Seattle Times compared his achievement to those of Sir John Franklin and Sir Francis Drake. That success stoked Amundsen's ambitions. He headed south and became the first to reach the South Pole in 1911 and attained global celebrity. He then headed north again, this time in a vessel, the Maud, built to withstand the ice. He hoped that the ice floes would take his ship to the North Pole, but instead he successfully navigated the Northeast Passage across Siberia, only the 3rd person to have done so. The Maud became a kind of multi-year floating laboratory, taking scientific readings. At one point, the Maud came to Seattle for repairs and refitting after its propellers were damaged by the ice. Amundsen stayed in Seattle for 6 months. He met a local Danish-American businessman, Hakon Hammer, who became his business manager. Amundsen was a spender and had to raise vast sums for his expeditions. When the Maud went back north to Alaska in 1922, Seattle gave Amundsen's crew a hero's send-off from a dock near what is now the Olympic Sculpture Park. Amundsen had used his time in Seattle to outfit for a new era of Arctic exploration with modern technology. On board the Maud were 2 new airplanes in crates. Amundsen intended to pioneer the Arctic from the air. He wanted to fly from Alaska to Spitsbergen in Norway. The 2 planes, a Curtiss and a Junkers, had neither the range nor strength to survive the rigors of Arctic exploration. So Amundsen raised funds and later returned with bigger, better airplanes, flying boats, to try another transpolar flight. But that expedition had to be abandoned after crash landing on the ice. And it turned out Hammer's business management had driven Amundsen into bankruptcy. Undeterred, Amundsen sought to fly north via even newer technology. He teamed up with the Italian airship innovator Umberto Nobile to fly to the North Pole in a dirigible with a Norwegian crew, American financing from explorer Lincoln Ellsworth, and a team of Italian mechanics. In 1926, the airship left Spitsbergen and in just 17 hours traversed the pole. Given serious questions raised about the accuracy of Robert Peary and Frederick Cook's accounts of reaching the pole on foot, and Richard Byrd's flight over it, it now appears that Amundsen and company weren't just the first to float an airship over the North Pole, but in fact the first on record to have actually reached it. The Norge fell short of its intended destination of Nome, though, and had a hard landing in Alaska. Still, it was a 20th century triumph. When they returned to civilization, aka Seattle, they were given a huge welcome. But the rather dour Amundsen took offense at Nobile and his crew, in part because he thought they were trying to hog the glory, but also because Amundsen was against fascism, and Nobile's success was embraced by the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. Some years later, Nobile would try his own Arctic expedition in another airship, but it crashed. Amundsen set out by plane to search for Nobile and his lost airmen. Nobile was rescued, but Amundsen's search plane disappeared in the far north, and like his hero Franklin, he's never been found. But relics like these snowshoes at the National Nordic Museum in Ballard help us remember that our region had a role in the adventures of polar exploration's greatest hero.
Hear more about this episode on the Mossback podcast. Just search Mossback wherever you listen.
Mossback's Northwest is made possible by the generous support of Port of Seattle.
Love that coat. I think everybody else did too.
We got it at that Army surplus store on First Avenue. And I wanted to have the whole sealskin kind of outfit, but no luck. So
The fur is a nice touch, though. Well,
it was hot in that suit.
Yeah, not quite the Arctic here, not yet.
Yeah.
But yeah, can you tell us kind of how you started on this journey for this episode of Mossback's Northwest? How did you come up with this idea?
Well, one thing I just do sort of as a matter of course, if I'm talking with a museum curator or somebody like that, I'll say, hey, I'd like to build episodes around an artifact, and do you have any interesting artifacts? And the curator at the National Nordic Museum in Ballard said, well, I don't know, we have Amundsen Snowshoes. And so that got me curious. I went down and looked at the snowshoes, and Amundsen, when he got back from the Norge expedition, he gave away a bunch of stuff to friends in Seattle because he'd made relationships with people when he was here on previous expeditions. And so a guy in Everett ended up with his snowshoes, and eventually they were donated to the museum. But the other thing about that was that my father, who is also named Knute, as was his father, named Knute. So there's a lot of Norwegian connections there. Amundsen was kind of a hero in our household. And one reason was that my grandfather, who was an engineer and worked in the maritime industry, had taken my father down to see the Maud when Amundsen's ship was here. And this made a big impression on my father, seeing this incredible vessel right here in town. And so I began just looking into Amundsen's visits to Seattle and realized, in fact, he had this kind of long-standing relationship. And in fact, the whole reason we're here is because people, came looking for the Northwest Passage, and this was as good as they could get, And yet it was Amundsen who actually traveled the passage for the first time. And where did he come to celebrate that? Well, he came to Seattle. And so it turns out Seattle, because of its location, was a major, especially in the 1920s, was a major jumping off place or landing place for people doing Arctic research and Arctic exploration. And that's a part of our history we don't really think about. At least I hadn't been thinking about it. So that's what inspired the episode.
Exactly. I mean, there are a lot of layers to that, but one of the inspirations was just an object that you saw in a museum, and that sort of is a theme that shows up in a couple of episodes this season. Sort of objects from the past. For example, one of the episodes is about the Panama Hotel, which is in Seattle's Japantown. And yeah.
Yeah, who knows about the Panama Hotel? Yeah, a lot of people do.
Yeah.
And but it seemed to me that there were a couple things that happened this year. One is that it was voted a city landmark. So that's always a big kind of hurdle for something to attain that status. It's also the 80th anniversary of the Japanese incarceration of World War II and the executive order that was issued. And so I thought, well, maybe the Panama Hotel, one of the special things about it is what it contains in its basement, which is this repository of luggage and personal items that were left there by people who were sent to the internment camps, and that were never recovered, never retrieved. People didn't come back for them. And the owner of the hotel has put in a plexiglass hole in the floor so you can actually look down and see these artifacts that are like, they feel frozen in time. And so we got to go take our cameras down and look at the artifacts and look at and tell the history of the hotel, what was special about it. That's actually going to be the first episode of this new season that'll air this week. And I was very moved by the experience of seeing these objects up close, hearing the story of the hotel and what happened to Japantown as a result of that, World War II.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And yeah, there are so many sort of everyday objects, somebody's shirt, or you found like a pillow with a picture of Mount Rainier on it, just little things that people say, like, maybe I don't need this right now, I'll come back for it. And then,
yeah, the objects, there's luggage, suitcases, trunks, but then there are also things like golf clubs, fishing poles, shoes. Naturally, I was drawn to a beautiful flannel shirt that was folded and sitting in a box as if it had been purchased yesterday. Mm-hmm. And I think the mundane nature of many of these objects is part of the power of it. And it's a little bit like a Pompeii. It has that kind of a feeling, an inadvertent time capsule.
Because it's of that moment, and then a lot of people never came back to claim those objects. And there's another object, I haven't seen it yet myself, but I thought it would be sort of interesting to see. And it does show up in one of the episodes this season, which is a cannonball.
The cannonball.
That you found on San Juan Island, right?
Well, yeah, so we decided to do an episode on the pig war. And I had a lot of ideas about how we were going to do that, and ended up doing a bunch of reading about the pig war. And of course, on San Juan Island, the National Park Service has a park unit that consists of the original American camp and the British camp, because it was jointly occupied for about a dozen years after a conflict over a dead pig between the British and Americans that really almost started a war. The warships from both countries and troops converged on this island to fight over who owned the San Juans. But it was all instigated by a farmer who shot a British pig, a Berkshire boar, by the way. And while we were up there, I was thinking about artifacts, and I asked a historian about it, and he said, well, in 2002, a couple of teenage boys were coming up from this lagoon area where the original American camp had been, and they were carrying a cannonball. And he said, where are you going with that? And they said, we're taking it home. And he said, well, no, you're not. But where did you find it? So they went back down, and it had been in a bank, lodged in a bank that had eroded, but it was wrapped by Douglas fir roots. And so they were able to date the roots that had grown around the cannonball and determine that it had to have been a cannonball that was fired from one of the British warships. And, we're told that no shots were fired in the war, but obviously they were doing cannon practice or they were firing salutes. They weren't, or maybe it was a show of force, just like see what we can do to this hillside. And so we wanted to get that cannonball for the shoot. And it turned out that the government, it's in storage, actually at Vancouver, Vancouver, Washington, but they wouldn't let us have access to it because the government is doing a comprehensive survey of ordnance that is in museum collections, and they have to certify that it's not live ammunition. But it's so far down the list, they're never going to get to it, in time for our shooting schedule. And so a producer, Michael, began, once he tracked down that cannonball, we found out we couldn't get it. It turns out that the Museum of History and Industry has a nearly identical cannonball that was also found on San Juan Island in the 1940s. And they also have part of another one that was found at English Camp. And so we went over to shoot the cannonball at Mohai's archives down in the industrial area down at Georgetown. And cruelly, they made me try to pick it up on camera. I don't know what's going to be in the video because they haven't edited it yet, but I couldn't lift it. I think it's just like 65 pounds of lead or something, and I just it's what the term oofda was made for. So anyway, that was our artifact. We did get a pig war cannonball. I'm very happy about that.
That's amazing. I can't remember. Are there more episodes from the season that have specific objects associated with them? Let's see. I guess there's some sort of more portraits. We have. Maybe you could just tell us a few episodes that come to mind from this season. That.
Well, this season there are a number of episodes that feature individuals. Mm-hmm. So we have a wonderful episode coming up on Paul Robeson, the singer and civil rights activist, who gave a series of concerts at Blaine because the U.S. government took his passport away and wouldn't let him travel out of the country. And so he did a series of concerts that were hugely popular. One of the first concert he gave up there in 1952, so where 30,000 people attended this concert. And he came back year after year giving these concerts. And of course he was wrapped up in the McCarthy era and whatnot. But so the artifact there is we actually have a recording of part of a speech that he gave there, and the artifact is the Peace Arch. I mean, what a perfect place for him to make his statements about world peace and brotherhood and the rights that all people should have in this country. We have an episode coming up about Wyatt Earp. Wyatt Earp, who came to Seattle during the gold rush and tried to set up a gambling parlor. And he got run out of town. And this is an episode that doesn't have a lot of artifacts, although the building that was his club, part of it still exists. It's on the 2nd Avenue extension, just down from the Smith Tower. But it's so graffitied and boarded over, you can't really see it. But we were able to dig up some material that shed light on why he came here and why he left. And that to me is just a fascinating, side story that I don't think a lot of people know about. We also have a story about Chief Joseph's visit to Seattle in 1903. The chief of the Nez Perce, he was a huge celebrity late in life, and after the Nez Perce War in the 1870s, he was banished, ended up in what's now the Colville Reservation. But he spent the rest of his life trying to get the government to live up to treaties it had signed that would allow him and his people to go back to the Wallowas in Oregon. It's an incredibly sad story, but in 1903, Edmund Meany invited Chief Joseph to come to Seattle and tell his story to a Seattle audience. And then Meany took him to a UW football game. And they weren't called the Huskies yet. I don't think they even had a nickname in 1903. And they played at the athletic field that was up at 12th and Jefferson. There's still an athletic field there. And various sports were played there. Well, the Huskies played there for a while. And it was, we have Chief Joseph's account of the game and what he thought of it, but more importantly, we get to hear from him about the injustices that he was speaking and how Seattle responded to that. I think it's a really, really compelling story in many ways. And after we actually filmed that episode, my wife and I vacationed in the Wallowas. We stayed at a lodge down there, and man, I can see why he fought so hard to get it back.
Yeah, gorgeous mountains down there. Okay, I think it's time. There's so many questions that you guys have been submitting, both online and in person. So I think it's time for audience questions.
All right.
I mean, I guess on the topic of artifacts, I mean, somebody asked a question about that, so I think it's an interesting one. Might kind of put you on the spot, but let's see. If there was a book called History of Seattle in 101 Artifacts, what would be the number one artifact?
Oh boy, that's a tough one.
Sorry.
Yeah,
ones
thanks
first.
a lot. Yeah. Well, I mean, there are a lot, you know.
Right, so many.
Mohi has a bunch of cannonballs, by the way, from the Battle of Seattle. People, when Seattle started to develop, they found cannonballs everywhere. So that would be one thing I can think of. There certainly would be. I'm biased, but there certainly would have to be a Space Needle artifact in there of some kind. Maybe I have a Space Needle cigarette lighter on my den desk. That would be a good one. Object of its time.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm actually happy to see that several people have asked questions about another project that we did together, which is not Mossback, but it's another podcast that we've launched a podcast in the Crosscut newsroom called Crosscut Reports. So essentially, I'm collaborating with reporters in the newsroom on stories they're working on, including Knute. And so for the first season, we put together 3 episodes about Victor Steinbrueck, because his son Peter Steinbrueck, one of his family members, found a whole bunch of documents of Victor's in a family house in the basement, in the cellar, and had just been sitting there for decades and decades. But there are all these like fascinating things, letters and documents of all kinds, sketches, his notebooks, his personal stuff, professional stuff. There's a lot of stuff in there. Anyway, so we made 3 episodes about that, and people are asking about that. So it made me think of it because of the Space Needle. Steinbrueck was one of the designers of the Space Needle. So, but yeah, I guess, people are asking, I don't know if you know this actually, now that I'm realizing, are you doing any further cataloging of the Steinbrueck archives, or are they already turned over to the UW? Yeah, several people have asked about this, so I guess maybe that's a question for Peter. He told me that he wanted to turn them over to the UW.
Yeah, he confirmed to me when we were done with the series that everything's going to go to the University of Washington. I thought the University of Washington already had Steinbrueck's papers, because when I wrote a book on the history of the Space Needle, I found a bunch of material there of his, but the mother lode was sitting in this dirt cellar in Eastlake, in an old house that was owned by a member of the Steinbrueck family, and had been sitting there. They're a gold mine. I mean, there are just we did 3 episodes, one on the Space Needle, one on Pioneer Square, and one on the market. And but there's so many other things in there about civic battles and everything. So I still have some of the material, which I need to return to Peter.
Oh yeah, that's
Peter,
right.
if you're listening.
I do too, maybe. Oops.
yeah,
okay.
and,
Sorry, Peter.
yeah.
Peter's doing that. Oh wait.
But yeah, he's gonna turn everything over to the UW collection, so which is great because it'll eventually everyone will have access.
Yeah, another side question to that is somebody asked, are there any treasures you ran across in those files that you plan to pursue for stories later? So I don't know if you have those ideas quite in your head yet, or maybe you do.
Not really, but I think reading, the way I sort of described it was many of these files, particularly the fight over the Pike Place Market, it's like you're getting to see the general's battle plans. You can see his notebooks as they, he had yellow pads from 1968, 1969, 1970. You can see how the campaign is changing its rhetoric, it's changing its tactics. Victor is pulling every lever he can to get the public aware of the danger to the market and why it might be worth saving. And so they just give you this intimate moment by moment kind of thing. I do think, I'd like to do a longer piece on that in video form, because I think there's a lot of great visual and audio material that we could draw on. But so that's kind of on my mind, is what else can we do with this material?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm interested in this question. Seattle's history is one of change. What do you feel is the cause of this region's dynamism?
It's a good question, and it's a complicated one. I think that because Seattle was a late starter as a city, and we went from literally longhouses and log cabins to the space age, to the space age within 100 years. And I think we became a place where it was sort of not that this was true, but I think it was perceived as sort of the last place you could go and remake society, where you could do a modern city, without the baggage of an old city. We're not Boston, we're not New York, we're not New Orleans. We could start fresh. And so there's, I think, across an ideological spectrum, there's the sense that Seattle is ripe with potential to get things right. And that's kind of our obligation. And whether you're Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates, or whether you're Eddie Carlson or R.H. Thompson or Arthur Denny, there's just a history of people with a kind of sense that we have an obligation to make a city and a place to live that's better than anywhere else, and we have a head start because of the natural environment. Someone once said our goal is to build a city as spectacular as the landscape, and I think that just has drawn people here. And like during the World's Fair, Robert Kennedy came to the World's Fair. He came to visit Seattle and spoke to a downtown business group. And he said, "You guys are so lucky here in Seattle because you have no history." Now, that wasn't true, but the perception was the new frontier is out there, the space age is out there, and you guys don't have the baggage that everybody else in this country has. And so anyway, I just think that in matters small, it's why we have these huge civic arguments over things like plastic bags. We tend to infuse everything with a moral consequence. And, that's not always a great way to do things, but it's also admirable in another way. So I think that's part of it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There's a sort of related, this question, is there a historical story you would love to tell but have been reluctant since it might be too controversial?
Well, I've done some fairly controversial stuff. I'm trying to think of what would be more controversial, but than Nazis and
Right. There's those
silver shirts and that kind of thing. I do think, we're in a time where I think it's really important to be able to look at more complete versions of our history. We did an episode last year on the Mercer, I call them the Mercer women, but the Mercer girls, and Here Comes the Bride, and all the kind of stuff that grew up around that. And I felt the story had not been told, that the motivations behind that involved incredibly racist thinking, the abuse of young girls who were forced into marriages because there weren't any other women around. It was considered a very sketchy enterprise, and it wasn't anywhere near what its worst critics thought. But I think there's sort of a reckoning about the conditions under which this area was settled that hasn't really been engaged. The reason they brought white women out is that was the way you could get more land, because the Homestead Act said your wife could double the amount of property you could get, but only if she was white. They delegitimized marriages between whites and Native women, even ones that had been legally bound. But when the missionaries got here, they said, well, the church didn't sanctify that, so the marriage is no good. I just think there are different ways of telling that story, or telling aspects of that story. The black exclusion laws of the Oregon Territory. I mean, we talk about the Oregon Trail, but the Oregon Trail was the first red line. George Washington Bush, who was black and was the first part of the very first settlement on Puget Sound, came here because when he got to Oregon and found that blacks were banned, he said, well, let's go north of the Columbia River where they can't enforce it. And I just think that it's so easy to overlook those things. And so I do continue to look for stories that can help surface some of those things that are hard to look at. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Because there are a lot of dark parts. I'm learning a lot about dark parts of our history as well from Knute. On a lighter note, where do you buy your flannel shirts?
Oh, well, that would be too much of an endorsement for a particular
okay.
for a particular outlet that started during the gold rush and is still making outdoor gear and shirts in Seattle. I'm a fourth generation customer. My son is a fifth.
Really?
So,
wow. so there are clues,
if Chubby and Tubby were still around, I would go there. You could get great flannel shirts for $5, but
so it's a secret we can deduce.
It's not a secret. I just don't want to plug them.
And what are some of your most used resources for historical research? I kind of like this question because I'm curious sometimes. It seems like you do spend a lot of time looking at old newspapers, which I find fascinating as a journalist.
Well, this is one of the great things, and it was a lifesaver during the pandemic. There's so much more available online in terms of old newspapers that have been scanned and are available digitally. The Seattle Public Library, if you have a library card, you could get free access to the Times and the PI. The Seattle Star is out there. I subscribe to newspapers.com, which gives me access to a lot of papers. So when you're doing a story on Wyatt Earp or something like that, you could find a lot of really great material in various newspaper databases that are online. The Seattle room at the downtown library is a great resource. The special collections at the University of Washington. one of the things I'm sort of really excited about from last season was we did an episode on Aishel Curtis, Edward Curtis's brother, who was the amazing photographer here in the Northwest, and probably the most important photographer from a historical standpoint that we have produced. There was such interest in that episode that people started finding and sending me Curtis images that they found in their garages or attics. I began communicating with the Washington State Historical Society, which has the Curtis collection, but much of it is not scanned. They have now been raising money and hired a curator to begin putting some 50,000 historical images, digitizing them in the next couple of years. And that is really exciting because that'll be a public resource. Those pictures can be reproduced without cost. And it's a real public service. So there was sort of a little Aishel Curtis nexus that kind of was created between institutions and me and readers and stuff that I think is going to really benefit people. So that's another resource. The State Historical Society is fantastic.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, I mean, I have lots more questions. You guys have lots more questions, but I think I am supposed to wrap this up now. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us, everyone in person and at home. Again, you can catch the new season of Mossback's Northwest when it premieres on KCTS 9 tomorrow night at 8:50 p.m. And subscribe to the Mossback podcast at crosscut.com/podcasts. We have a number of podcasts. Check them out. And thank you again to our sponsors. Thank you, Port of Seattle, Bedrooms and More, and True Cup Roasting Company. All right. Good night.